Where are they broadcasting from?
They're not very far.
Hey Jerry, how are you doing? Well,
Yeah, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on the show.
yeah, I've been looking forward to this for such a long time. I've been reading to reaction view for quite some time, and I'm glad we got the chance to do this. But before we get into this, so much stuff that we have planned out, let's start with who is Jerry? Where are you?
Oh, okay, sure. Who am I? That's a good question. I have been a venture capitalist for almost 30 years, I guess. Almost. 28 years or so. And I started in the 1990s. Yeah, right. 30 years ago. Sorry, I'm having trouble with basic math. Started 30 years ago in the 1990s. It was great being a venture capitalist in the 1990s because any idiot could make money. And I was that idiot. So I learned a lot while still thinking that I was a genius because it was so easy to make money. And then the dot-com crash came. I was in New York City when back then and now. The dot-com crash came and I realized that I wasn't really that smart. So I spent a few years kind of managing the portfolio we had, and then I decided to leave and start a company. So I became an entrepreneur, started a company. We raised a bunch of venture capital. And after 4 or 5 years, I realized that I was not a very good operator. Like running a company was not my skill set. I didn't like to tell people what to do. I liked to hire people who knew what to do already, which worked out okay. But it just wasn't me. So I stopped doing that and I started investing again, although I started investing in the company I was leaving. They took over, they fired a bunch of people. So the investors took over, put somebody else in place, fired a bunch of the people I'd hired. And I started backing them when they started companies because I had hired people who didn't need to be told what to do. They were entrepreneurs because I didn't want to tell them what to do. So that's how I got started. That was 15 years ago-ish, 16 years ago. So I've been angel investing ever since. It's been an interesting ride. The environment has changed a lot since when I started. First one way, then the other. It's kind of been a roller coaster.
I want to go back to the part of the internet boom where you were thinking you were a genius. A lot of people were thinking they were geniuses. At that time, where everything was going right, but it had to be corrected somehow later down the line. How did you really deal with feeling with someone like who had it all, going right for himself, and when things started to not work out the way they did? What did that period look like? Switched.
Yeah, I mean, well, I was one of those people, and here's an anecdote. In 1998, we had a party for the portfolio company CEOs in London, and we all went to London, and they were in London for a meeting, and we had this party at a nice hotel. And a friend of mine from college from high school, had been working in London, and I invited him to come by at the end and have a drink, so I could see him. And he came by and he walked into the room and he's like, "Oh, are these guys all billionaires?" And I was like, "Well, there's 8 billionaires in here, in this room." He was, astonished, I guess. But they were 8 billionaires in that room on paper. And then, 2 years later, there were none, right? None of them, because they were billionaires because of the ownership of their own companies, which after the dot-com bust weren't worth billions anymore. And I think at that point you could see some of them picked themselves up and said, "You know what? Easy come, easy go," and they started new companies. And some of them said, "Well, that didn't work," and went off and got jobs. I sort of never heard from them again, really. I mean, I obviously heard a little bit, but they weren't starting new companies. And the people who started new companies ended up doing really well. And I think the people who got jobs ended up doing well too. It was just different. I think it was the same for me. When the bubble collapsed, I owned a bunch of internet stocks, and I saw pretty much all of my wealth disappear. I mean, I wasn't that, I was young, so losing all your wealth when you're 30 is not a big deal, because there wasn't that much of it, and also you have time to make it back. But the corporation that owned the fund that I worked for, gave me two choices. They said, "Hey, look, this isn't going well. If you want, we like you. We could get you a job at one of the other companies we own, and you could be like the CFO of this company, or we could find you some other job that's a good job, or you could buy the portfolio from us and leave." And I think most people in my life said, "Hey, it's a Fortune 500 company. You're going to have this executive job. It would be great to stay there and work there and be successful." And I said, I can't leave my portfolio behind. I can't leave it. It's my baby, so I left the portfolio. I bought it, using, help with somebody else. Somebody else bought it, and I represented them, and it was their money. And then 2 years later, that was in 2001, in 2003, we bought out the outside investors because things were so bad. They were like, "This is completely worthless, this portfolio." So we bought them out, and for really not much, not much money. And then the portfolio came back. One of the companies went public. Other companies became worth a lot of money. And I owned a piece of that, and that's how I got the money to start angel investing later. It took years, right? I think it was like 2007 when that finally paid out. But for me, it was, I believed in the internet. I was a believer. And a lot of people, and people don't realize this, but probably, about 20 years ago in 2003, a lot of people thought the internet was a fad that had ended, that it was like, okay, well, that was crazy. And now we see that it's useless, and now we can start ignoring it and go back to the ways we did things 10 years ago, 10 years before that. And I didn't believe that. I just didn't believe it. So that's why I took the risk to buy the portfolio, and that paid off. So, I think, what do you do when things turn bad? Well, you have to kind of sit back and say, A, what do I really believe is going to happen? Because, what's happening isn't always what's going to happen. Things go up, things go down around what really is the truth. And the second thing is, how much risk can I take? This is something that I always tell, I teach a class in entrepreneurship at Columbia University, and the students will often ask me, well, I've got this choice between this job, good job at a company, or going to this kind of risky job at this startup. What do you think I should do? And obviously I'm like, well, I think you should go to the startup. And the reason is, my first job was at a big company. And
Wrong question to ask.
Yeah. They're asking me for a reason, I suppose. Maybe they want me to convince them. And I'm not trying to convince them. I'm like, but here's the thing, right? Like, my first job, I worked for IBM, right? Giant computer company. I was a cog in the machine. There was no way I was ever going to be CEO of that company. It were like 20 less layers between me and the CEO. It was almost impossible. But I wasn't learning that much because I had a very narrow job. Where then I went to work, when I worked for a startup, I learned everything. I learned, so many things because I had to do everything, right? So my feeling is, you go work somewhere like that, you take a risk like that when you're young, and you learn things that that nobody's going to teach you, for another 10 years in your career, right? And you're going to learn things that you'll never learn anywhere else because you're going to be stuck in, maybe you're in marketing at some big company. All you learn is marketing. You'll never learn about the finance side or the product side. It's a broader education. And I think when you're young, you invest in your own education. And that's a risky thing to do when you could otherwise go get some good job. And, but I think the entrepreneurial people are willing to take the risk, and the people who may have been in this ecosystem because it seemed like it was a safe bet, when things go badly, they'll decide not to take the risk.
How do you keep that conviction when everything is sort of going wrong? Like, when internet was going on, everyone around you was saying that the internet's not going to work, it's a fad.
Yeah.
How do you maintain your conviction and not steer away?
I think I'm stubborn. It's a good question. Why did I believe it? It's an interesting question to me now. What is it, 30 years later, because I'm not sure that I would still make the same choice now. It just not because it was the wrong choice. I mean, obviously it was the right choice in retrospect, but there was no way of knowing, right? This classic uncertainty. Is it going to happen or not? No, there's no way of knowing. But for me, it was just, it was my life, I mean, like I was so invested in computers and in the internet. I'd gone to work for one of the first companies to commercialize internet access, back in the early 90s. It was just, I couldn't see how you would do without it. But I don't think it was like a rational thing like that. Like if I'd sat back and, made like okay, here are the pros and cons, I probably would have been like, wow, this is a bad idea. But that's just a safety thing, like you're like, okay, well, gosh, this seems really risky to do this. And yeah, sure, it was. If I had been wrong, my life would have turned out differently, right? I'm not sure what I would have done if the internet had turned out to be a fad. I don't know what I knew at that, other than that. But I wasn't. And I think it's like you take the risk and you look at the potential upside. You're like, well, look, I could be wrong, and then I'm going to have to go get a job. Or I could be right, and then I'm going to be part of this thing that's changing the world. Like, it's not really like evenly balanced, So, there's, I don't know, I have a lot of confidence in myself. So many times in my career, I've said, all right, if I'm wrong, I'm going to have to go get a job. But I'm pretty sure I could get a job, So, that was always like, okay, well, what's the worst that could happen? I'll go get the job I would have had anyway. I mean, maybe I have lost a few years in the career path, but who cares?
So, like the way that you are doing, I'd say it's more like your intuition rather than rationalizing it, is it?
Well, I think, I know like you'd want to talk about uncertainty, right? And I think there are some things where you can't predict the outcome, right? You just can't know. I mean, the funny thing is in the early 90s, when I was deciding I wanted to go do something more, tech forward, there were a couple of choices. There was this new internet thing, like the World Wide Web, the browser had just kind of come out. And I'm like, okay, well, that's interesting, but there's no there, because at the time there were like 10 websites. I mean, it really wasn't much, right? But it was interesting technology, not groundbreaking technology, right? I mean, anybody could write a web browser. It was not some technological breakthrough. It was a breakthrough in saying like, well, we're all going to use this same way of presenting websites, this HTML, right? So it was a consensus that we'd use the same language and then we'd all be interoperable. And that's what made the internet really interesting. But the other technology that was much more promising at the time was this multimedia stuff, where you could put like the entire encyclopedia on a CD-ROM and plug it into your computer. And it would have pictures and sound and all this stuff going on. And you're like, wow, that's amazing. Like you could take all of this. Like I used to have a set of encyclopedias that was like a bookshelf long when I was a kid, like everybody did, and you put that all on one, just in your computer. It's crazy, right? I mean, you didn't have that on the internet because nobody had put the encyclopedia into the internet then, because who was going to do that? Who's going to type that in? Not the people who owned it, right? They didn't want to get it for free. So they instead put it on CD-ROMs and they would sell it to you. And this multimedia thing was pretty cool. Like you could use your computers to see video and audio, and you couldn't do that on the internet, right? Because there wasn't the bandwidth. So if you looked at like the technological features, the multimedia CD-ROM stuff was much more interesting than the internet. And I had this choice between the two. And in the end, I was like, well, you know what? The internet is just cooler. It's just it's just cooler, right? Like you can talk to anybody on the planet. It's amazing. Like that. Yeah, that's just cool. I mean, I know it's useless, but it's cool. So I'm gonna do that. And then, and the multimedia thing went away, right? Because who needs a CD-ROM when you have the internet? It took years, but I didn't know that. Nobody knew that, in the end, it was really just like, what do I want to do with myself? Like, I don't want to work on these, putting information on CD-ROMs. It's an interesting and useful technology, but it's really boring. Whereas the internet just seems like you could do anything. And that's really interesting. I just want to see what happens. So I don't know. Yeah, you're right. Is it a gut thing? I don't know if it's like a gut thing. Like I'm like, in my gut, I really believe the internet's going to work. That's not what happened. I said, you know what? I don't want to work on this stuff. It's boring. I want to work on this other stuff that's interesting. And now I don't think that's necessarily a great way of picking things, but it worked in my case, and it's a better way of living. Like I would rather have been interested for 20 years and unsuccessful than bored for 20 years and successful. So it depends on what your success function is.
What were the people that were not sharing your belief? What were they talking about the internet? How did they look at it?
I think, it's funny. I was in New York. I was on the East Coast. Most of the internet stuff was happening on the West Coast at that time in the 90s. I mean, the internet originated on the East Coast in the 70s, but I had used it in the 80s when I was younger, not legally, but and it was just kind of like there was no web, right? But and then the web, originated in Switzerland, right? So the web browser, it's the web browser was like in Texas or Illinois, right? I mean, it was all over the place. But in the 90s, like the people who were really gung-ho about it were in California. So I would go out to dinner with people in New York and they'd be like, what are you working on? I'm like, oh, I'm working on this thing called the internet. And they'd say, what's that? Right? Like they had no idea. And the internet, this was like 95, 94, 94, 95, 96. And people started to learn about it because once Netscape went public, people started to hear about it. And then I remember going out to California and having dinner with a friend, and we were sitting there in a restaurant chatting, and the people at the table next to me were talking about the internet. And I was like, oh my God, there's other people who talk about the internet, So at the beginning, it was like just nobody knew about it, right? And, you tell people like, I'm working on this thing, they'd be like, well, that doesn't sound very interesting. It sounds kind of stupid. Like, why are you doing that? Why are you working on something interesting? Like, I don't know, derivatives or like, it's New York, so a lot of financial people. Aren't you packaging up, interest rate swaptions and selling those? I'm like, okay. So there was that. And then later on, everybody got super excited. And like in 1999, you're like, hey, I work on this internet stuff, or I'm investing in internet companies. And people be like, hey, can I buy you a drink? Can I buy you dinner? It was, everybody was interested. And then, of course, when the bubble popped, there were a lot of people who were kind of like, I told you so. I told you this was ridiculous. It's like, okay, well, and then so when I went and got the money to buy the portfolio from the place I had worked in 2001, like I said, everybody in my family was like, well, that's a really bad idea. That's, and I said, okay, that's fine. I mean, you don't have to do it. I'm doing it, like, you can go get a job. And, but I think at that point in your life, when you're the age I was then, people are used to you being stubborn or they're not, so anybody was kind of like, hey, Jerry, let me sit you down and give you some life advice, because they knew that would go badly, for them. So, people were kind of like, all right, well, you can do what you're going to do. I mean, I had been successful to that point, so who can argue? Yeah, I don't know.
How old were you then?
In 2001, I would have been 35.
Yeah, so that's relatively old. No, that's relatively old.
That was a while ago. I'm older now.
Like, I'm relating it to the guy, like, I mean, to myself, but more of the guy who sort of asked you the question when you went to Columbia to teach the class. So for that person, like the person who like just figuring stuff out, for them to build conviction at the same level and have sort of stubbornness about something that you had when you were like 35, is that possible?
Yeah, totally. I think, well, yes, it's not easy. So, I mean, when I worked for IBM, I told you, out of college, great job, engineer. IBM was known at that time for being a place that people worked their entire lives. People didn't quit. People weren't fired. They were, they worked there their entire lives. And so when I quit to go, because I was bored, I quit. And I look back sometimes fondly to that job because it was so low stress.
Boring.
But it was interesting, but it was like so low. I don't know. It just wasn't for me. Anyway, so I quit. And my grandfather called me up and he said, "What are you doing?" So what do you mean, Grandpa? I'm going to go and get, I'm going to go to business school and get an MBA. He's like, "What are you doing? You work for IBM. You could work there your whole life. This is this is like the best job in America. You'd never get fired. And I said, "Okay, Grandpa, I hear you, but that's just not, that's not me." And I think, it's funny, I'm a parent. We have 5 kids, my wife and I, and you think about them, you're like, I want them to have a good life, but I want them to be safe, and I want to stop worrying about them. Like, I don't want to have to worry about the crazy things they're doing anymore. I want them to go get a job and be an accountant and just go, do that for the rest of their lives, and then I don't have to worry. I don't really want that, but you know what I mean. But then when they go out and they don't do that and they do something great instead, you're proud of them, And I think for my grandfather, he was like, "Well, you're crazy. You're giving up this easy, good job where you can make good money and have a good life and raise a family and own a house in freaking Poughkeepsie," which is, and I didn't. And then, I went and did something else. And he was like, "You know what?" He said to me, he said, "You got a lot of moxie," which, he's like, "You're out there, like you're doing things, you're making it for yourself." He was proud of me for doing it, for having the moxie to go off and be my own person rather than taking the easy path. And so, my students will come to me sometimes and they'll say, "Hey, I have this choice." And I'll ask them, I'm like, "All right, well, how important is it to you to be the person your parents want you to be?" Because you're going to have to talk to them about that, right? And it's totally true, especially at Columbia, where the people who get into Columbia have been perfect their whole life, right? Like, they've gotten great grades, they never got a B, they've always gotten A's, they've done everything exactly right, and that's why they got into Columbia, because it's hard to get into. And you say to them, "Look, all right, you're going to take this job where there's a really big chance that you're going to fail, or your company is going to fail, or it's going to look like they failed and you failed. Can you do that? Like, and can you instead of going to work for Google, where your mother and father can tell their friends, 'Oh, our son went from Columbia to work for Google,' and their friends will be like, 'Wow, that's pretty amazing,' and be secretly jealous. Like, can you give that up and like not give your parents something to brag about, but instead go do something that's really meaningful instead? And is that going to ruin your Thanksgiving, or is it going to be okay?" So, that's like, they have to get over that part, because their parents have expected them to do, to kind of climb this ladder that's already set out, because until then they had. And you're saying, "Hey, look, why don't you not climb that ladder and actually just forget about the ladder, because that ladder is completely, made up." Okay. And then there's the flip side, right? So I didn't tell you the whole story about my startup. So the whole story about my startup, I said I went and started a company, and then after a few years I left to go back and invest. The whole story is that I didn't leave, I was fired. So the investors in that company decided, and I don't say that because it just sounds crazy, and but the investors in that company decided they could put somebody else to run the place, who would make money immediately. Like, they could take what we had, and instead of losing money, they could make money, but then of course they'd stop growing. So, me and the other co-founder said we'd rather grow than make money. We can go raise more money, and grow and become a much bigger company in the future. And the investors we had said, "No, we don't want you to raise more money and maybe become really big. We want you to stop raising money and make money today." And we said no. And then they fired us. I mean, fair enough, whatever. But at the time, it felt like a huge failure to me, right? Like, I've just been fired from my own company. Like, that's, who does that happen to? And of course, it happens to plenty of people. Yeah. But I think you need to, like, the point is that what happened next was really interesting to me, because I thought I was kind of disgraced, right? Like, I mean, I'm in New York. It was not a big venture community at the time. We had taken venture money, and I was like, okay, well, now everybody in New York knows I've been fired, which was probably true. And they're all kind of like, "Well, what's wrong with that guy?" I'm thinking this, am I, as I'm sitting at home. And as I'm sitting there, like the week after I was escorted out of the office, one of the venture capitalists who had invested in the company, he wasn't on the board, he didn't vote me out, but he was an investor in the company. So he'd heard all the stuff. He calls me up, and I was like, "Oh, geez, do I need to take this? Is he going to yell at me? What's happening here?" So he calls me up and he says, "Hey, let's go have lunch." I'm like, "Dude, I'm sorry, I know we don't need to have lunch." Like, he's like, No, I need your help. I was like, what do you need my help for? He's like, well, I got this other company that needs somebody who has some experience to help them figure out these problems. And also, I just want to find out what you're going to do next, because if you're starting another company, I want to make sure that I'm there and can invest. And I was like, what, really? Why? And he explained, he said, look, I know it didn't work out this time, but you seem like a reasonable guy. You've learned a lot of stuff. You're much smarter than you were 3 years ago, because you've been running this company, helping one of the people running this company for 3 years. So you know way more about running a company than 90% of the entrepreneurs I see. And, next time, you made some mistakes. Next time, we'll avoid those mistakes. Like, you're just a better person to back than the person you were 3 years ago. I was like, oh, that's really interesting. It made me feel better, and it made me feel like, okay, I can go start something new. I actually did learn more. And it's true, right? I knew so much more. I got a business degree. I got an MBA. And when I finished my MBA, I knew nothing about business. I knew some formulas and some theories, but I didn't know anything about business, right? I'd never run a business. And now I had run a business. And I knew much more than I learned in my, much more than I would ever learn in school about running a business. It's the only way to do it, is to actually be hands-on. So yeah, I do the same thing now as an investor. People who ran companies I'm now backing one investor for the third time. Actually, I think she's the second one I'm backing for the third time. In her case, the first company failed. The second company, they hired a different CEO and she left. And in each case, there were some things she didn't do perfectly, but she's so much smarter than every other founder, right? Because she's run companies now for 12 years. She's experienced. So of course I'm going to back her next company. So I think the difference is there's this kind of view of failure in the wider world of well, success is moving up this ladder, right? Climbing this ladder, getting a job at Google, then getting a better job at Google, then maybe going and getting a job at Amazon, right? And climbing this ladder of power. But in reality, success is is doing the things you want to be able to do, doing them well, making some money. And in that case, even if you go to work for a startup and it fails, you haven't failed, right? Because you as a person have learned a ton, which you can bring to your next endeavor. You've learned much more than you would have learned working for 2 or 3 years at Google. So I don't know. This is what I tell people, and I believe it. It's because it's based on what happened to me and what I've done. But you have to kind of internalize that and say, I can start a company, and even if the company fails, I am further along the path than I would have been if I hadn't started the company, whatever that path is.
It does there are a lot of places to go from there, but I'll go the last part from the failure part or the other one. Is the main reason why people don't want to face uncertainty failure, really?
Failure in a way, right? So let's step back a second. So uncertainty, right? What is uncertainty? Uncertainty means you can't predict something. And by predict, I mean you can't predict, right? If you and I were sitting in a cafe and I said, hey, I bet the next guy who walks into this cafe is going to be, 5'8" or shorter, you'd say, yeah, I'll take that bet. That'll be about 50-50, right? We could predict, right? Not the next exactly, but, if I said, I think, of the next 20 people who walk in, the average height's going to be, 5'6" or more. That's not a bet anymore, right? Nobody would take that bet because I'm going to be right. Yeah, if they're guys. And I think that's, so the when things are unpredictable, you can't do that. You can't say you just have no idea what's going to happen. And, I think in some cases you can say well, what's the market for artificial intelligence going to be like in 10 years? And the answer is, I don't know. I can't put odds on that. I can't say, well, 20% is going to be 10 billion, 40% is going to be 15 billion. You can't do that. It's not possible. There's not enough information, right? It's new. Nobody knows. So you can pretend to know. You can't know. Right? That's uncertainty. So the question you had was, are people afraid of uncertainty? Well, yeah, of course. They should be, right? Uncertainty is not knowing what's going to happen, not being able to predict. And that makes your life pretty hard, right?
So is it the original thing I was getting at is like, is it because of the fear of failure or fear of the unknown?
Okay, so, well, I mean, the unknown is anything, right? I mean,
Yeah.
people do fear uncertainty. Yes, they fear uncertainty more than they fear risk. That's been academically shown.
Yes.
And yes, I think people. I do think people do that. I mean, look, if there's no uncertainty, there's no real decisions you have to make. I mean, you think you're making decisions, except you're not. Because every decision is sort of analytically possible to compute. You can say like, well, should I do this or not? Well, here are the odds, and here are the outcomes, so I can pick the best path for me, knowing those things, and I don't have to make a decision. It's just analytically, this is the best option. No, that means that depends on you being smart enough and having enough information, but in some way, you're not making decisions. You can just kind of sail through life, playing the odds, and you're and that's kind of not that stressful. I mean, you're still at the whim of fate. Like the odds might turn against you. You might roll the die wrong, but you're not making decisions. When you can't know, you actually have to make decisions, right? You have to say like, should I go with the multimedia or should I go with the internet? Like nobody knows. I have to make a decision here, right? Like this is an actual decision. It's not like, well, multimedia is certainly going to peter out in 5 years because the internet's going to. I mean, you don't know that, right? So now it's hard, right? You're making a decision where you could be wrong. Like, it's but and there's reasons why you should do that, right? But yes, people are afraid of being wrong, especially smart people, right? I mean, I think pretty much for my first 20 years of life, I was never wrong, right? I mean, like, not really. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but like I was an engineer. Like, I would take a class and I'd either be able to solve the problem or I couldn't. And if I couldn't, it was because I failed and I didn't do the studying, I didn't do the work. But the problem was solvable and there was a right answer. And if I got the right answer, I would know it was the right answer because, that's how engineering works. And so it was different, right? Than saying like, well, I don't know what the right answer is. And I won't know if the answer is right after I have an answer. I might just be wrong. Like, if I was wrong on a test in engineering school, it was because I was stupid, right? But I might just be wrong. I cannot be stupid, And that's kind of, you don't want that. Like, who wants that?
Most people, from what I've seen, from the people I've talked to, like the people I've had on and seen online and stuff, the people who really like want to impact the world or make it better, change it in some sense, the founders or stuff like the founders or people like that, or people that do bring about some change, they usually feel like two differences, two ways they can go, making the world a better place, or like feeling miserable for the rest of their life, like working somewhere and stuff like that. What do you think causes that difference?
Well, why do I think there's that kind of dichotomy between the two things? I don't really think there is. I mean, look, I'm a bit of a cheerleader for entrepreneurialism, obviously. I know a guy who worked for IBM, and he had a job at IBM where he was like the financial person for a small department or a medium-sized department. And they gave him a promotion once so that he would be in charge of like 10 people who had his previous job. And he did it for about 6 months, probably a year. And he said, hey, I'd rather have my old job back. Like, I want to go back to doing the job I did because I liked that job. And because when I had that job, I could leave at 5 o'clock and go and play tennis, go home, have dinner with my family, sit down with my wife and watch a movie, right? So like the life that he wanted. And to me, that he was older than me. And when I met him, and still older than me, it was inconceivable to me. I was like, well, why aren't you trying to do more, right? And the answer was he was happy, right? And a little bit later, I kind of realized, I'm like, that's a good thing. Like, he had a good life, right? And there were certainly in some decades where his life was so much better than my life was, So, but it wouldn't have satisfied me, and that's just my personality. It satisfied him, and I think that's amazing, right? That he could be like, what's important to me? This job isn't the most important thing in my life. Like, the job is something I do. I like the job. I make some money, and the money helps me support my family, have the kids, raise the kids, and be there for them. And that's the most important thing to me. Like, You know what? Yeah, that's there's nothing wrong with that. So the dichotomy, I think, doesn't exist. Like, it's not like you're going to be like, I'm either changing the world or going to be miserable. It's like you're either changing the world and you're going to be miserable because it's super stressful and things aren't going your way. And it's really hard to change the world and people don't want to agree with you and people are fighting you. And then sometimes they fire you and sometimes you have to fire them. And then sometimes you run out of money and you're sitting in the bar on Friday night being like, I don't have enough money to pay people. And that's changing the world. Or you could be like, I've got a job and somebody else has to deal with the stress because my boss just wants me to get the work done. So he's like, don't worry about, the corporate politics. I'm taking care of that. I'm protecting you so you can get your job done. If you need more money, let me know. We can give you a raise at the end of the year so you can have a slightly better life. It's not going to be huge. You're not going to be a billionaire, but you're going to be able to buy a house in the suburbs and raise some kids and, put them through college. Like, that's not bad. I mean, I think some people may have jobs they hate and then it sucks, but it's neither. It's not like it's either or. You can be happy doing whatever it is you do, especially if you're successful at whatever it is you're doing. But it's it really depends on who you are, right, and what you want. And again, look, I've lived now for 30 years with entrepreneurs, and that's basically everybody I know. I mean, in my family. And my wife's an entrepreneur. So, it's like pretty much, and so I do have a certain viewpoint, but I don't want to pretend that I'm right about that. Like, this is my viewpoint. And this, I think, if you want to be an entrepreneur, this is the kind of viewpoint you should have. And I think, look, who was it? Scott Shane wrote a book, has written several books about entrepreneurship. And one of them, he did some research. He asked people why they became entrepreneurs. A whole bunch of people, not just like high growth tech entrepreneurs, but thousands of people across all sorts of different entrepreneurial types of companies, big companies, small companies, people who are just self-employment. Said, why did you become an entrepreneur? And the most cited reason people became entrepreneurs was because they didn't want to work for somebody else, right? And this and this is like so true, right? Like, I mean, I had a problem at IBM. The reason I quit was partly because I'm like, the people I work for are idiots, right? And they weren't idiots. I mean, in reality, they were not at all. They were smart people. They were good managers. They, were good people. And I think that's what drives people to be entrepreneurs. It's like, I can't work for other people because they're not going as fast as I'm going. They're not trying things as, they're not taking as much risk as I want to take. They're not teaching me the things I want to learn. All the things that people feel. And if you feel that strongly enough, you're going to say, like, I'm just going to have to go do this myself. And that's why people become entrepreneurs. And it's funny because when I think about that, I'm like, yeah, pretty much everybody I've backed in, my career has fallen into that bucket of like, well, I mean, I could go work for some other company and probably be successful, but why would I do that? I don't want to work for them. They can work for me. So, it's a personality thing. Like, but then the flip side is there's a lot of people in the world who are like, who don't believe that, who don't think that everybody else on earth is an idiot, right? Now, that's probably a good thing, because they aren't. And those people might say, you know what, I like working for somebody else because they can deal with all the corporate bullshit and shield me from that so I can just do my job, which I love, right? Like, it's just a different personality in a way.
Wow. How does this relate with, like, this is on a personal level, but how does this relate with when someone is building technology or something? Like,
well,
you talk about Apple and stuff. Is that different there?
No, I think it's especially true there. I mean, because one of the things that people get frustrated with when they have jobs is the slow pace of change, right? And when you work for a bigger company, they have an incentive not to change things really quickly, right? Because they need to have some control over what's happening. They don't want you to be like, hey, let's throw out this way that we've always done things and put in this entirely new way to see if that works, right? Like, that's just not what big companies do. Like, right? I mean, it would be crazy if you were in charge of the person saying that to be like, yeah, go ahead, let's blow it all up. I mean, like, of course you can't do that. But then I think people get frustrated. They say, like, you know what? And again, from my personal experience, when I was at IBM, I was like, hey, why are you doing things this way? Like, this is really slow and takes up a lot of time, and everything goes really, it takes, 3 days to do something that should be done overnight. Because we have computers now, right? Like, you're a computer company. You should use the computers to do the things. And And they're like, look, this is just how we do it, blah, blah, blah. And it was frustrating to me to say, like, we could change this and make it better, but you don't want to because that's not our job. Like, we were supposed to be building things, not building things to build things, and I actually went and built things to build things. So I built some software that said, like, this is going to make my job easier. And then I built some software that made my job easier. And then everybody else in the building, like 1,000 other engineers, adopted that software because it made their jobs easier. And I won this award. I won the Employee of the Quarter award. I was like 23 years old. So I'm like the Employee of the Quarter at IBM, right? I'm like, wow, that's a great little plaque. I still have it somewhere in a closet. And I said, this is great. Like, I have made a difference at this company in a way that me doing my job wouldn't have, right? Because I've made everybody, like, I've made 1,000 jobs better, not just one, not just my job. I like, why don't you have me do this? Why don't you have me make everybody's job better, right? Like, I could be in charge of that. I could do that. And they said, that's not your job. Like, your job is to go back and design that tiny little, square nanometer of, this chip. Like, that's it. Just, these 10 gates, make sure those are optimal. And I said, I think I could be doing more with my life. And I think you're all idiots. No, I said, I was like, I think I could be doing more with my life. But, I mean, like, it hasn't been like all. So, yeah, no, I mean, I think in technology, it's especially true because there's these opportunities to change that big companies are going to be hesitant about. And if you are the person who really believes that could make a difference, you're going to have to go not just somewhere else, but probably off on your own to do that. So, yeah, no, I think especially technology, people are, they get frustrated with the people they work for and go start their own thing.
How do the like people that sort of building technology or that built technology at that time too? Like, I'd say you were in New York at that time.
In the New York area. Yeah, I worked for when I worked for IBM, I was in Poughkeepsie, which is about 2 hours north of New York. But yeah, I spent my whole life in the New York area.
But like a lot of technological progress at that time was happening sort of in this Bay Area, San Francisco, in that region, farther away from New York. How the people there sort of in San Francisco, people like Steve Jobs or even everyone thought of that building during that internet era. Zuckerberg slowly during that, they just started during that time. What do you think the way that they look technology and uncertainty, how do you think differed from the way the folks, I don't know, that did not share the same worldview as them? How did they look at it?
I think, it's when I started investing in New York, and when I started investing for myself, when I started angel investing 15, 16 years ago, I would tell people that I was a Silicon Valley style investor. So I invested like Silicon. That's the style of investing I practice as a venture capitalist, which wouldn't make sense anymore because everybody invests that way. But at the time, the New York venture capitalists were much more focused on how are you going to make money? How are you going to make money soon? It was much more about like, are you building a profitable business in the near term rather than are you building a really, really big business that may be profitable 30 years from now or whatever, who cares? Amazon wasn't profitable famously for 25 years or something after they started, and nobody cared. And that was, I think the Silicon Valley thing was like, okay, let's not focus on becoming profitable soon because we can always raise more money. Let's focus on becoming really valuable very quickly. So yeah, they definitely, which, of course means you're taking both a lot more risk and a lot more uncertainty, right? Because if you can build a company that's going to be profitable 2 years from now, well, you're only taking that, risk and uncertainty for 2 years. If you are saying, well, let's wait much, much longer, well, you're just kind of compounding it, so you have to have the stomach for that. And not least as an investor, like when I invest in a company for the first time, one of the questions I have to ask myself is, when they run through my money, is somebody else going to give them more money? Because as an angel investor, I can't give them like, $10 million, right? So when they run through my money, like, is somebody else going to give them more? Because I can't. So that's a huge risk. Like that, this finance risk is it weighs on me every time. If they were going to be profitable with my money, then I wouldn't have that risk. So, but then of course, if they're going to be profitable with my money, they couldn't really get that big because they have to grow more slowly. So yeah, no, I think that the Silicon Valley mindset was always much more about building value rather than building than getting rid of risk as fast as possible. So yeah, different.
Do you think is that true today? Like, I mean, it is true today, of course, but do you think has that amplified today, sort of with what you're seeing with OpenAI and stuff?
I think it has gone in both directions. So on the one hand, everybody in America started investing that way in 2018. I think people just realized that it took a while for people to realize that was the successful way to invest. The people who were kind of the old New York venture capitalists and the old venture capitalists, they just disappeared. They went away because they never made that much money, right? I mean, they made okay. I think some of them made okay money, but like if you're going to say like, I'm going to only invest in companies that can be profitable in 2 years, well, those companies aren't going to be very big because, right? I mean, and then they're not going to be that valuable. So you'll make some money, but it's more like private equity than it is like venture capital. So I think those venture capitalists, they just disappeared from New York. And the people who remained were the people like me who were doing it, the Silicon Valley way. So it was really a market evolution. I mean, we all made more money because of the zero interest rate policy, right? So companies went public and that maybe shouldn't have gone public and, or got bought by bigger companies because they were afraid they were going to become really big. And I made money from that. I made money from companies that I loved, but sold to companies who then shut them down like 2 years later. So, I mean, I don't know what would have happened if those companies hadn't bought them. Maybe they would have had to shut down 2 years later anyway. Or maybe it was the companies bought them and they were incompetent. I don't know. It's possible. But yeah, no, I mean, you made more money that way. But I don't think that was what changed the investing style. I think it was the fact that it worked in that environment, in that tech environment. I think now you see people who are trying to do that and it's less successful because there's not as much new technology that can be exploitable by small companies. You've got you got like AI, but the problem is to really do well with AI, you have to have, people raise $1 billion to become an AI company. Like it's hard for a small company to compete there, or probably impossible at this point. I mean, if you were able to compete with OpenAI as a small company, you would probably do better to have Google buy you, for $1 billion than to start your company. So you see people investing in things that are more likely to become profitable sooner because they don't have any other option, right? So they'll say, I see this a lot, and this is one of the things I mentioned in that resignation letter was it feels like people are just taking tiny slices of really big markets. They're like saying like, hey, you know what? Nobody has built a system to book yoga classes on 5-story walk-up, yoga studios. It's like, okay, so you're the 5-story walk-up yoga studio booking platform. They're like, yes. And this is how big that market is. It's like a $200 million market, and we're the only company in it. It's like, okay, like maybe you'll make some money, right? I mean, why not? It's, you're providing a service, you're a company, you make some money, you charge more than it costs you, but you're never going to be big. Like you're not going to grow to be $1 billion company in 5 years. Like that's not possible in that market because you're just kind of, shaving this tiny slice off a much bigger market. The flip side is there's not a lot of risk. And I know that example is ridiculous. But I see these examples where founders come to me and say, hey, look, there's a product that this group of people absolutely need. We can use technology to do better than what they're doing now. And, I've already talked to 20 people. Each of them wants to pay for it. And, so it's really like kind of a slam dunk. It's like a no risk proposition. It's never no risk, but it's a very low risk proposition. And I say, well, great. How big is that market? And they say, well, in 5 years, we're going to be $20 million in revenue. Like guaranteed. I'm like, great. Well, how big will you be in 20 years? They'll say $20 million in revenue. Like, that's it, right? Well, I mean, what do you do there, right? Like, if you're a private equity guy, you're like, that's great. I would love that. If you're a bank lending money, you say, hey, I'll lend you money for that. I mean, there's like no risk. I mean, theoretically. If you're a venture capitalist, you kind of have to say, that's not the business I'm in. And I've said this to people several times. I'm like, look, you don't want my money, because if you take mine, I'm not going to be satisfied with your 20 million in revenue and no growth. That's not going to. They say, well, but we can sell the company then, and you'll get your money back. You'll get like twice your money back. Like, yeah, but that's not my business, right? I want to get 100 times my money back in the 1 out of 10 times it works, and none in the other. Like, that's just the business I'm in, and that's what I'm geared for. So yeah, no, I think it's going, but venture capitalists are doing that now because those are the opportunities they have. And so I think that the business is going both ways. You're kind of getting people who are taking bets on, technology that doesn't exist yet. I know people who are betting on AI because they believe the cost of providing, the kind of LLM services will come down a lot. Like, it'll become democratized, and that may be true. It's true of many technologies, right? The technology. Yeah. And if that is true, it opens a lot of doors. Like that, if that was true, it would, there'd be a lot of things changing. It would be like the introduction of the microprocessor, right? Like, there were, I worked for IBM. There were computers before the microprocessor. Like, the computer industry was one of the largest industries in the world. IBM was one of the biggest companies in the world before the microprocessor, right? So it's not like the computer was invented in 1971. That's not what happened. The computer was made cheap in 1975 because microprocessors finally came down where they were like, you could buy a microprocessor for $25. And then it was like, okay, now it's cheap. Now anybody can do it, right? Anybody off the street, some hippie and just came off a commune and hadn't taken a shower in a year could build a personal computer and then build a company around personal computers, right? Because that was Steve Jobs. Before that, like before the microprocessor, if you wanted to build a computer company, you needed a lot of money and a lot of engineers, and nobody would give you that money unless you were already an expert, right? Because you came out of IBM or you came out of one of the other computer companies. So if AI comes down in price, I think you'll see all these opportunities like you did with personal computers in the 70s and 80s and 90s, starting to open up, and that'll be a whole new world. But if it doesn't, then it won't. It won't be a venture backable subset of companies. So people are doing that, and then other people are going and saying, "Hey, let's take this lower risk stuff because we can make money, not as much, and it won't be great for long because maybe we'll make 10% returns, and people can get now 5% returns on pretty much risk-free stuff. So it closes the gap. So we're gonna have to see what happens."
When you think when we sort of AI reach that point of sort of the microprocessors that are being introduced during the internet era versus for like the equivalent time period for that for AI?
I do think that, although I don't know enough about. I'm not on the leading edge of the research. I know how they work. I could build you a simple one. It wouldn't be very good. But it's the basic concepts on there are pretty well laid out. Anybody can go on YouTube and learn how to build an LLM. The thing you would have to do to make it cheaper to run, would be to somehow compress it, right? I think it's
compute is the bottleneck. Compute is more of the bottleneck. That's it.
Yeah, compute is, but I think LLMs are kind of like how people always said like you only use 10% of your brain, right? There's this old cliche: you only use 10% of your brain, which is I think true, except what they mean is you're only using 10% at any one time. It's not like 90% of your brain is never used. I think that's probably like LLMs, like they're only using 10% of the network at any given time. So there's probably a way you could change that so that it was compressed into a way that you were using a lot less compute. Although it may come you could no longer then make it learn. I don't know. That's off the cuff what it seems like to me. So they're definitely trade-offs. And we'll see, right? I mean, people are obviously working on this, and there's a feverish amount of work going on, a ton of money being thrown at it. Things are changing every day. But until that happens, I don't really think it's a great place to invest as an investor. Unless you've got $1 billion, in which case, yeah, go.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, yeah, I mean, first throw your money at it. That's what you do, right?
Yeah.
Um, but let's see. I think we went all over the place, and like we started with uncertainty and sort of ended with uncertainty too.
Yeah.
It was an uncertain conversation, but I'm just so glad we got the chance to do this. This was like I'm glad. I hope you enjoyed it too. Like I got the chance to get some topics out of my mind too. Like one question which I like to end with. I've been into startups, VCs, all these things. Like 11. What do you think is one fact that will blow 11-year-old me mind?
We have no idea how our own body works. Really?
Yeah.
That's something in mind, right? Like we know so much about so much, and yet if you're like, well, how come people have epilepsy? Nobody knows. Like they just don't know. Why are some people smarter than others? Like, don't know. We don't know. You know, I mean, it's just we have no idea how our body really works. We kind of know how some of the mechanisms work, but it's kind of crazy, right? I mean, don't you think we'd be more interested in that than really anything? It's just, I think it's too hard. It's too hard for us to figure out. So
And that like continues to
blows my mind.
60. That continues to blow 60-year-old me. I think that's it from my saying. Anything you'd like to say? End with?
No, just thank you. I had fun. This was fun. It's the best one I've done so far.
Yeah.
So